Years ago, the Christian school that was a part of the ministry in Fort Myers that I was on staff for a number of years had a family. Also, they were actually a part of the church. And normally when there were school events, you would see the parents and the grandparents for two elementary age kids that would show up and were very faithful to all the activities that the kids were involved in. And I don't remember the actual progression of what I'm going to tell you, but I do remember this happened. There was a point at which that family had a fruit basket turnover. What do I mean by that? It was actually mother and father, mother's mother, grandmother, and stepfather, grandfather. Except somewhere along the way, mom and dad got a divorce, grandma and granddad got a divorce, and mom married her stepdad, and dad married her mother. And they continued to be together all the time as a family at events. I don't know whatever happened to them, but I frequently thought about those kids. You know, what are the values? And how do you manage when you're splitting the difference between, oh, this is my dad, no, he's my granddad. This is my mother, no, it's my grandmother. That's just bizarre, isn't it? Pretty messed up. And that's what happens when we take good values and we split the difference in how we interpret them and how we actually live out life. And I want to talk to you today about the subject of parenting. And what should that actually look like in our world? How should that actually be lived out within our world? And how do we have a key to a long life? And it goes back to the passage in Ephesians 6 that we're very familiar with, verse 1, that says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Today, I want to look at verses 2 and 3 because there's just some great truth in these verses. I'm actually reading it from the Amplified Version because I like the way it puts the shades of understanding on this. Honor, esteem, value as precious your father and your mother, and be respectful to them. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may have a long life on the earth. So, do you want to live life well? And do you want to live to a ripe old age? Then Paul says you need to honor your father and your mother. What does that mean? What does that look like? I want us to look at this and look at this understanding of parenting and of what it is to be a parent. And it goes back to this understanding of verse 1, "Children, obey your parents," which is the formative season of nurtured obedience. It's in childhood where that children are shaped for life in learning to do things the way they ought to do. Have you ever been around a child who was not well disciplined? I remember so many years ago being with a family at a family event, and it was hot summertime in East Texas, and so there was a fan on the floor, and there was this little boy, probably 4 years old, who had found some kind of a stick, and he was taking great pleasure in taking that stick and poking it into the fan. And of course, I anticipated that mom or grandma, who were both sitting there, one of the two of them was going to take action, and they were going to correct him or at least take the stick away from him. No, that didn't happen. They both looked at the rest of us in the room and said, "Isn't that cute?" And somehow, this guy with very few filters kept from saying what I really thought. That's another kid that I wonder what he's doing today as an adult, how many banks he's robbed. Because he certainly never was corrected as a kid. How do we balance that? For the flip side of things, I grew up where everything was a sin, everything was wrong, and I was disciplined to the hilt. I remember at 3 years old going into the Murphy's grocery store with my parents, and there was bubble gum on a counter. I helped myself. I was dumb enough in those days, I was only 3, to go ahead and just put it in my mouth. And we had one of those old Woody Ford station wagons, and I was in the 3rd row, chomping on my gum, when all of a sudden I felt the wrath of God in that vehicle. And I looked in front of me, and I could see my dad's eyes looking back at me through the rearview mirror. And I knew that I was in a heap of trouble. And that was further emphasized when he said, "Bill Andrew," because anytime my middle name got called, that was just a giveaway. You're in trouble. You've done something wrong if both names get called out. "Where'd you get the gum?" And I wasn't yet smart enough to say, "Mr. Murphy gave it to me." Of course, that wouldn't have mattered. I'd still had to go in and had him verify he did it. But I'll never forget when the penny, that's how much it was, the penny got passed back to me. And at 3 years old, I had to walk back into that grocery store and hand them the penny and explain to them why I needed to give them a penny by myself. I want to tell you, that's the last thing I ever shoplifted in my life. Because I was always scared, even when I was older, that somehow my dad would find out. It wasn't because I was holy, it's because I was scared to death. But how do we raise kids right? Proverbs 22:6 reiterates what Ephesians 6:1 says. "Dedicate your children to God and point them in the way that they should go, and the values they've learned from you will be with them for life." Now, understand that a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the ideal, not necessarily the norm. I understand that for the most part, we're all a work in progress. We all have things that are still not quite where they should be. There's still ways that we're measuring up. There's ways that we are still trying to do what we ought to do, and we don't always pull it off. But the truth is that the first thing for us to understand, if we're going to be parents that raise kids well, is that they have godly values because they see those lived out in who we are. If there's anything worth anything in me, I give a great deal of the credit for that to an extremely godly mother who lived a very consistent, very humble, but very steadfast Christian experience in front of me. I was raised in understanding what it was to be a godly person. And I really believe without any doubt that part of why it's been easy for me as an adult to understand what those values ought to be and be able to sort out what's right and what's wrong is because I saw it lived in front of me in every aspect of how my mother lived. And I think it's so important that as parents, our kids see us living a godly lifestyle. It's important to remember this, that we are called to be blameless, not faultless. There's a difference. Blameless means this, that the issues that are still a problem for me, the things that I don't quite get right, I'm aware and I'm open to be made aware and I'm willing to deal with those within my life. Because the truth of the matter is, you and I were born into a sinful world. And our mind, our emotions, our intellect is still having to be rebuilt on a consistent basis because of it being born into this sin nature with our spirit dead. And because once we were born again, then we still have to live out the challenge of what it is to be people who are struggling with the struggles within our own mind. And so there's going to be times I miss the mark, so I'm not going to be faultless. But if I'm letting God perfect that in me, then I'm learning how to live a blameless life. And that's exactly what kids need to be able to see. They don't need to see you be perfect. They need to see that you are willing to do everything in your power to please God. And that when there's something you realize is not okay, you own it. And so you don't create this false piety or holiness. You live in a real world, but you do it in such a way that the goodness of God is evident in how you're living. And then I think it's very important with children to have them embrace age-appropriate responsibility in chores. There shouldn't be kids that everything gets done for them. I was raised in a home where when I think about it, my mom did a lot of the household chores because my dad thought because he grew a garden, because he was busy in the ministry, that he had no real responsibility at home unless every once in a while he decided he was going to cook one of his specialties, which included things like possum and squirrel. So we really preferred him not to do that. So much so that when I was married as a young man, I still remember the day that the garbage in our house had been put in front of the front door where you could not get out the front door without taking the garbage out. And it was a difference in values in that she had a dad who always took the trash out. My mom took the trash out. So I was headed to work just like my dad would have been done. And I remember just moving the trash enough so I could get out the door. And I did. That was not a good decision. It's important that we teach children to take responsibilities, that they learn to have chores. I think allowances are fine if they're appropriate, but there's nothing wrong with them having responsibilities that they earn their money. And what a great opportunity then if you begin to do that to teach them to tithe and give over and above their tithes. Teach them early financial principles that will guide their life from now on. Be able to help them understand there are responsibilities, there's chores that are just a part of who you are. You've got to do your homework if you're going to school. There's ways, I'm so proud of my grandson because one of the things he does, he has multiple jobs right now. And he is he's a junior this year, be a senior next year. And he was working at Whataburger. Just got a new job at the movie theater, and his boss at Whataburger said to him, I'm understanding you've gotten another offer that you're going to take, but would you be okay with this? Would you be okay if we still leave you as an employee here, and at least once a month you come work a shift so that we keep you as an employee here? I was kind of proud of Andrew, and I was even more proud of his answer. Well, that'll be okay, I'll do that. And then on the side, he mows yards. And this is what makes his granddad proud. He sent me pictures, and then we were there, I went and looked. Because it's a big deal to him that when he mows, that you edge the sidewalks perfectly. Now, I'm going to tell you this. You have not mowed your yard if you do not edge your sidewalks. If you let dandelions grow in your yard and you don't edge the sidewalks, do not say you know how to mow a yard. Just saying. My grandson is just about as bad as I am about it. It has to be perfect. So much so that he has a buddy that mows yards with him, and he's smart. His buddy has the pickup. They put the lawnmower in. But his buddy isn't as conscientious as he is, so he's literally gone back after they've done a job to straighten up the line on the sidewalks that his buddy didn't do as well. That's a kid who's going to be a good worker as an adult. I'm proud of my kids for how they're raising my grandkids, because they're being taught some of those right values. More importantly, the spiritual values that I see coming through in them, in what they're doing. This is the same young man a few days ago came home and told his mom there's a homeless man who's standing on the street corner, and he's better than I am with one of those signs, and he's been taking him snacks. And recently he had opportunity to just kind of visit with him, get to know him a little bit. And you got to understand, Andrew's an introvert. This is not the kid who's friendly to everybody. He's an introvert. But he wanted to know if there was any way he could pray for that guy. Do you know what that does for me as a grandfather, to know those kind of values are coming through to my grandson? And it's not because I've told my kids this is how you need to raise your kids. It's because they know how to raise him. They're doing it the right way. And it's so important in these formative years that obedience be lived out in a very healthy way in what needs to be done, so that then your children can emulate the spiritual and relational values that they've learned by watching their parents. Oh, God, help us that our children never have to do as we say, not as we do. May they know how to live. May they know how to be a marriage partner. May they know how to be a parent, because they're emulating what they observed when they were growing up in how their parents raised them. And so today, that probably is instruction more to those who haven't yet but are planning to have children, or those of you who are still raising children. I challenge you that during that season, you live out Ephesians 6:1, that you teach your children how to obey God as they learn to obey you as a parent. Now, I've just given you the easy part of this message. The hard part of this comes in the second verse that we just read, which is about honoring your father and mother. That's really the adulting season of life that highlights honor. Leviticus 19:3 says it this way: each of you must show great respect for your mother and father, and you must always observe my Sabbath days of rest. I am the Lord your God. This is kind of a mixed message this morning. It's what should we do as adults related to our parents, but it's also what do we do as parents with kids that we are still engaged with that are coming into young adulthood. We probably have a few empty nesters in this house. We have a few people that your kids are now grown, or you're in a mixed stage where you have some grown, you still have some at home, but it's a different time than when all the kids were at home. And as a young adult, it's so important that children transition from dependency to healthy independence from their parents. It's important that when a child becomes an adult, that child is being able to do what needs to be done in such a way that they are able to manage their lives. And it's a transition. It doesn't just happen immediately. As a teenager, there's things you begin to teach your children. There's responsibility. There's consequences you let them live out because they're going to need to learn those. There's going to be some times you're not going to bail them out when they misspend their money, because they need to learn how to figure that out on their own. They need to maybe do without a couple of things because they didn't manage it. I am so thankful that God loves me so much that I'm in the grandparent phase in the age of technology, because the whole world of iPads, iPhones, video games, all the things that social media, all the platforms that are out there. I mean, I'm so proud of myself that I can somewhat navigate Facebook. And I at least know what Instagram is. You know, I thought TikTok was a game that you play with tic-tac-toe, but there you go. And then don't even get me into the world of what is Snapchat. I don't understand, and I don't know any of the others that are probably out there that I'm not even aware of. But it's a challenge in parenting because kids are now in a different day. And as your children begin to be adults, you have to let them begin to live some of the consequences out of what they're doing. And one of the things that is so important is to be able to have kids take ownership of adult values that are connected to the foundational values you've put in them. There is a point at which you have to make decision as an adult. Do you serve your parents' God or do you serve your God? Because I was raised with parents who did a lot of the right things. But as a young adult, I didn't necessarily want to do what they did. We were people that you were at church if the doors were open. You didn't miss. Because number one, my dad was the preacher. But as a family, you were there too. If you were sick, you went there because either God would heal you in the service or you'd be handier for the funeral. You didn't stay home. I remember when I went away to college, I went to a Christian university. But I never will forget that semester, the privilege of sleeping in on Sunday mornings. And I was, by that time, the little boy who stole the gum had learned a lot about how to be deceptive. So the Sunday before the week that I was going to go back home and visit, I'd go to Sunday school and church because I knew when I got home, you know what my parents were going to ask me? So tell me what First Baptist Church is like these days in Shawnee, because they both used to live in that town. How was Sunday school last Sunday? Man, I had the right answers. They didn't know I hadn't been there 6 weeks before. Because you see, at that point, I had not yet determined what my value was of being in God's house. There's a point at which you can't live out of your parents' values. You have to determine what is God saying to you, and hopefully you've had parents that have laid great foundations in values so that you can make healthy choices. But you have to establish values that are your own. And so as a parent who has a young adult child, don't do what my parents did when I came home from school. So how was church last Sunday? They didn't really care. They just wanted to see if I'd been. They were still parenting me in an obedience format. And it was at that transition point so that as a parent with adult children, you begin to have different relationship with them. You begin to ask different questions. You begin to have different conversations. And what's rewarding is then when that child looks at you and says, you know, I've been thinking a lot about what does it really mean to be a follower of Jesus. Can we talk about that? Now the door's wide open. It's a different ball game when you're having to say to them, boy, I really wish you'd go to church once in a while. But when you are able to let them begin to function as adults, even if they're making choices you wouldn't make, even if they're living in ways that you wish they weren't living, but you trust that you trained up the child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. They will come back to those values that are deeply entrenched. And so it's very important to recognize that if you have adult children, you no longer are in the role of them obeying you. You're now in a place where they need to give you honor. And so when you begin to look at that, what does that mean in a world you and I live in? Because again, everything I've been talking to you about is the model of how it should be, not the reality of how our world is. Because we live in a world that has a lot of messed up families from God's perspective. If I were to ask this morning, how many people in this room, or if you're online, how many of you have step-parents? It will probably be more than half of the people in this room. How many of you spent time in your childhood in a single-parent home? Again, it would probably be at least half of the people who are here or online today, because we live in a different world. Did you grow up with an abusive father? An abusive mother? I'm not asking you to answer those questions out loud. I just know that underneath the surface in a lot of folks' lives, there is deep pain related to parents who weren't everything they should have been. And so this subject says, honor your parents. It's easy to honor a parent who did it pretty right. It's another ball game when you had a dad who beat you severely as a child. How can you give honor to that kind of dad? And it's important to understand this. There is one thing to be able to honor the person. And if you cannot legitimately give honor to that person because of how they lived it, then your place of being in right standing with God is understanding the position of father that God intended. And to say, my father may have been a horrible person, but I honor the fact that God still worked in my life, and He was my father. So that you are able to give honor to the position of what a father should be, even if your dad wasn't one who lived it out well. And this is what it does for you. If you walked around with a dead dog strapped to you all the time, there would be a point at which other people would not hang around you. And the longer you strap that dead dog on you, the odor would begin to change when you came on the scene. And hopefully there would be a point where you noticed it. You know, the old saying is that when you smell yourself, other people have been smelling you for 2 weeks. And when you are still so angry at an abusive parent as an adult who's been dead for 15 years, you've still got the dog attached to you. And that's where, when you can begin to honor the position, you can let go of the person who held that position. Because now you are making right with God His intentions, and you're letting go of the person who failed miserably. Is that easy to do? Absolutely not. Is it important to do? Yes. How do you do that? With the grace and strength and help of God. And to understand, you never say it was okay for them to do what they did, but what you say is, regardless of who they were, what they did, God allowed them to be my biological parent, and I honor the fact that God allowed me to come into this world through their parenting. And when that honor comes, it releases you from the things that would hold you back. This is another thing about adulting and relationships between parents and children. It's so important if you are a married adult that you give preference to your mate over your parents. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall, use good King James language, cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. I'll tell you, in all the years as a pastor that I've had couples sit in my office that were struggling in marriage relationships, one of the most common elements that I've dealt with has been where there is a woman who is struggling because her husband is more worried about his mother thinking something of him than what his wife thinks. And I've had 40 and 50-year-old men who are still talking to mama every day for instructions of how to live their life. And their wife is going, would you just once think about what I think and what matters? And they don't hear it. Or let's flip the coin now that all you ladies are saying, get him. Flip side of that, I knew a couple who, her dad was a minister. And he was one of those kind of ministers who lived it out to the hilt. He mowed his yard in his white shirt and tie because he was a pastor. And he needed to let people see the dignity of his role in the community. And she married a guy who was one of the happiest-go-lucky guys in the world. Didn't wear a tie if he didn't have to. And she was always reminding him that he wasn't what her daddy had been. And at 50 years old, she was the biggest daddy's girl in the world, and her husband was chopped liver most of the time. It's important that in honoring your parents, you get the priorities of God's order in place. And as an adult, no longer are your parents in the key role. If you're married, your mate is. And if you're single, you're preparing yourself so that if you do get married, you're going to be able to make a transition because you get what I'm talking about today. And that is this, with your parents as an adult, they no longer are the ones to tell you how to live your life. And if they try to do that, it is not dishonoring to let them know that they no longer are who you need to obey. You love them, you'll hear their opinion, but you're going to do what you believe God wants you to do. Pull the God card on them every time. That just isn't what I feel like God's saying to me. Even if you haven't prayed about it, it's not what God's saying to you, so you're not lying. It's important that we learn to have healthy relationships. And that as parents, we learn to let our kids become who they are and live out their adult lives. And that as adults, if you have parents that are in your life, making sure that you're putting the relationship to where it needs to be. Because we get verse 1 and verse 2 confused in Ephesians 6. Don't ever forget what I'm saying to you this morning. Ephesians 6:1 is the childhood relationship of parents and children. Verse 2 is the adult relationship of parents and children. You obey them as a child. As an adult, you honor them, but you are living your life with the values they help set and the values God is developing in you as an adult. And when we begin to learn that, then we can live in such a way so that we can be pleasing to God, so that the promise of a long life comes because we truly are honoring the way God intended for it to be. And understand that the other thing, life is full of transition. And so you begin to establish new norms for what generational family time means. It's not uncommon that nearly every family growing up has Christmas traditions. And this is how you do it. Just out of curiosity, how many of you grew up and you opened presents on Christmas Eve? Just raise your hand a minute. A few of you. How many of them that was just not allowed? You waited and you opened presents on Christmas morning? Yeah. Now here's where the problem comes. You get married and you open presents on Christmas Eve. And your new mate opened them on Christmas morning. When are you going to open presents? Well, when you get the fight over with, you'll settle on one or the other, or maybe you open 2 on Christmas Eve and 5 on Christmas morning. You'll work a compromise out in the family. Now, if that wasn't complicated enough, your family always knew when they observed Christmas dinner, and probably you went to grandparents' house for a different meal, and if you had parents who still had parents that were functioning as their own lives, you had 2 different sets. Now you had 3 Christmases you have to work out every year, and only 1 Christmas day, and football games are on Christmas, which is what God intended anyway. Dear God, help us to just make life easier. So you have to work that stuff out. And one of the challenges that we have in adulting is how do you work those things out with parents? And remember this, you're here to honor your parents, not obey them. And the first Christmas that you decide we're not going to do what the family has always done, and your mom looks at you with those deeply wounded eyes, you got to remember, I no longer am supposed to obey her. Mom, I sure do love you, but we're going to have to do this, and we'll have to work through getting over it. Any of you need coaching on how to have those conversations? For $100 an hour, I'll coach you all day long. But when we don't do those things, we live dysfunctional lives where you're running from one house to the next on Christmas Day. And by the time it's over, you can't wait for New Year's to get here because you don't have to go to family on New Year's. You sleep through the ball dropping on TV. God help us to understand that things change. And there will be a point, I don't care how strong those things are, there will be a point where generationally it will shift. And you'll begin to operate from a standpoint of now, you're the older generation, you have adult kids, and there's going to be a point where they're going to look at you and say, Mom and Dad, I love you, but you know, we're not going to be able to do what we've always done because we now are doing things with our kids. And we need to do that. And here's what you need to learn to say. That's wonderful. Practice it with me. Say, that's wonderful. See how easy it was? It's amazing what happens when we learn to put some of these things into practice, because then it truly lets you live with the honor relationship. So that you give honor to your parents, but that doesn't mean that you do it the way it was always done. And sometimes they may never understand it. Now, let's take this a step further. And that's this. It's that verse 3. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Man, I wish my dad had read that verse. Because he apparently never did. Because he sure knew how to provoke you to wrath. What's the mandate for healthy parenting? It's stated sort of in a different way in Colossians 3:21. This again's amplified. Fathers, do not provoke or irritate or exasperate your children with demands that are trivial or unreasonable or humiliating or abusive. That can also be mothers, not just fathers. Nor by favoritism or indifference. Treat them tenderly with loving kindness so they will not lose heart and become discouraged or unmotivated with their spirits broken. This is particularly true back in the obey role, but the same principle this carries over into the honor role. It's the way you're supposed to live life in how you parent. It's important to remember this. Parenting is a progression. It's a progression of moving from being a trainer to a coach to a mentor to a cheerleader. When your kids are little, you're their trainer. You're going to have to tell them every step of what they need to do. Remember teaching your kids how to tie their shoes? You know why I had a problem with that? I couldn't tie my own. So my instructions are buy shoes that you don't have to tie. Get shoes with zippers or slip-ons. It's a great way to live life. You don't trip over shoestrings. You got to train your kids. And then somewhere, as they're becoming a teenager, you begin to mix it between being a trainer and a coach. Because now you got to begin to send them out to some of life. You can't go on that job interview for the first job with them. Because if you do, they probably won't get the job. And if they do, it probably isn't a very healthy boss. There's points at which in those teenage years, you're becoming a coach. And then there is something that every 16-year-old does along the way, and maybe several of those, that I don't know any other word to describe it. And this is a bad word that you shouldn't use, but sometimes they just do stupid things if you're looking at it from a parent's point of view. What were you thinking? I shouldn't tell this. Hopefully he doesn't watch our services. My same grandson I'm so proud of decided that he was going to do some work on his car headlights. And there was something that he was supposed to do with a torch related to them. And he didn't have a torch, so he got the bright idea of putting them in the oven. He has good parents. When he bought the new headlights, he put them in. You know, what was he thinking that putting in the oven would result in a good turnout? And before I get too critical, I have done some things that are just as stupid as that. That just doesn't happen to be one of them. But it's in that phase where you're mixing, where now you go back and sometimes you're back to being trainer because they're not living up to being coached. And then as the late teens and moving into the very early 20s, you're now in that role where you're beginning to move out of being a trainer because it's time that if they can't figure it out, if you're fixing it for them, you're still going to be fixing it for them when they're 60. So now you're in that role where you're a coach and mentor so that you're able to now take them from the point where you're saying, this is what I think would be good for you to do, to say, you know, let's talk about what you're doing and tell me how that's working out for you. And letting them talk it through with you. Let them begin to open it up. And then what's wonderful is when you get to the phase where we are with our kids, because the majority of the time, we're their cheerleaders. I'm going to tell you, I'm very proud of my daughter and son-in-law. I think they've done very well in decisions they've made. They haven't made perfect decisions, but they've made a lot of really good decisions in how they live life. They're godly. They're faithful to God's house. They're very good in how they manage their money. They're good parents. And I can't remember the last time I said to them, you know, I think this is what you ought to do. Or the last time I said to them, have you thought about maybe if you did it this way? And we're a long ways from me looking at them, since Aaron no longer works here, we're a long ways from me saying this is how you're going to do it because I'm the boss. We did have a few of those conversations because now he was not my son-in-law, he was an employee. And boy, if you're that's a whole nother, let me just run this rabbit trail down. If you have a child that's working for you, you got to do the kind of thing that I heard Henry Cloud say one time. He said there was a guy who had a son who had graduated from college, a business owner, and he brought his son into the business with him. And he found out that his son was being mean to the employees. And so he called his son in and he said, son, let me talk to you as your boss. You're fired. Now let me talk to you as your dad. Son, I heard you just lost your job. It's learning how to make those distinctions. How do we divide those things so that we do things in a healthy way? And if you're an adult and you have parents that don't know how to do that, how do you try to help get them to there? Or do you just look and say, you know, they've been like this for 50 years. They're not going to change now, so I'm not going to get into it with them, but I'm also not going to let them run my life. It's both directions, both ways. How do you manage that? Because in all of those, if you do what is functional and healthy, you're honoring your parents, even if they think you're being a really bad kid. Are you doing what's healthy? And are you living from being a functional person, not dysfunctional? And how do you live from that realistic relationship? What are the things you're never going to change about your parents? What are the things you're never going to change about your children? What are the things that are what they are? And yet, how do you live with healthiness as the priority? Whatever your situation, whatever stage you're in right now, I would encourage you to go home and pray and think about this. If you're a young adult with parents who drive you up the wall, begin to seek God on how do you deal with that in as healthy a way as possible, knowing that you're probably not going to change who they are. And yet, they're still your parents. How do you live healthy in that? And if you're on the older side of that, you're a parent, you have adult children, how do you learn how to move depending on what age they are? If you have a 20-year-old, you're probably still in that mix of trainer, coach, and moving toward mentor. If they're 25, you better be out of the trainer business totally. And by the time they're 30, you better be in mentor and cheerleader. And by the time they're 35, if you're not cheerleader and you're still having to coach, mentor, or train, you need help because that's unhealthy. And they're not going to be able to honor you properly, and you're not going to be able to honor them properly. So it isn't just an issue of, well, that's how we are. It's an issue of, are you going to split the difference in what God says, or are you going to live according to His Word? Are you going to honor your parents, and are you going to be parents who are living in such a way that your children can honor you? How do you balance that? How do you live that out? Everybody still love me? Let's land the airplane. There's another aspect of this. We've talked about childhood. We've talked about adulthood. Now let's talk about another phase of adulthood. And I've called this the crowning glory of the golden years. Psalm 71 verse 9 says, "Do not cast me off nor send me away in the time of old age. Do not abandon me when my strength fails and I am weak." I think the other challenge is as we get older, for those of you who are getting older, just saying, as we get older, there's things that we used to could do pretty easily that you don't do as well. And as you get older, there's things that become health issues you didn't face when you were younger. There's ways that you're preparing to go to glory, and the body doesn't function quite at the level it did when you were 20. Sometimes the mind is not as clear as it once was. I really like what I read in that book, Strength to Strength. It isn't sometimes that you're in dementia. It's just that your library has so many books in it that it takes longer to go to the right shelf. That really made a lot of sense to me. So how do we handle the golden years? How do we handle this time? And one thing I love about LifeBridge as a multi-generational church is we have so many folks who in their 70s, 80s, and 90s are so vibrant and so active. I so appreciate that Ruth, getting ready to turn 97, is still extremely vibrant, and she doesn't miss anything. I saw her shake her head no when I first said we were going to honor her today. She's still got it. And I'm so thankful that so many of our folks that are moving into senior years, and truly with some of the health care that's available to us and things in our world, there are ways that the saying 70 is the new 50 has a lot of truth in it, because there's ability to live fuller lives just in so many ways. But one of the things that has to happen is you begin to come to terms with shifting realities of the age and health issues. And what does that look like? How do you live that out? How do you manage that? Both sides of the equation. As you become the parent who's in that older role, and your kids are beginning to have to help you make decisions that are hard decisions to make, now it seems strange because it feels like they're becoming the parent and you're becoming the child. I won't say, does anybody know what I'm talking about? But it happens. And again, I think if you learn to live out this honoring in younger years, those senior years will be far easier, because honoring is still the same principle. Now you're honoring them and they're honoring you. It's just that you're shifting by the realities of what life is about. And I think one of the things that is happening is, as you get older, you want to gain wisdom from God. God, how do I do this now? It's different. How do I manage my time? How do I manage my resources? When is the time for me to downsize the house, or whatever it is that you're having to do? I think we at all ages need to have trusted advisors, people who really have wisdom that we can bounce things off of, aren't going to make decisions for us, but they help us to think well. And then there are people who are literally geriatric practitioners. They help folks that are seniors know how to navigate the medical system, the housing system for seniors, all of those things. There's a lot of experts out there, and there's nothing wrong with consulting them. And there's times that that's a great resource for both the adult child and the adult parent who are trying to navigate this new role of now the younger adult is taking responsibilities that feel like parenting, and the older adult is taking responsibility to let them. I still remember when Grace and I got married. As an adult, I had always paid the bills, managed the checkbook, did everything that had to do with finances. And when we were getting real serious, one day it dawned on me, I hated it, but I did it. It dawned on me, I don't have to do this anymore, because I now have my own personal CPA. And that was great until one day I found myself justifying something I just spent money on that I would have never thought about, because I would have just gone and done it before, and I thought, I feel like the kid. And the good thing is our relationship is such that I said, you know what? This is how I'm feeling, and we immediately were able to talk through and work out where it was healthy again. I learned that I have a credit card, and as long as I don't spend over the limit, I can spend it. If I spend up to the limit, I may have conversation, but I can spend it. I'm still an adult. But we worked it out. And that same thing has to happen in these kind of relationships. How do we work that out? And then here's the key. Whatever stage, let honor always guide whatever relational practices are needing to happen. Wherever you're at, if you're a young adult dealing with a parent who's getting older, having a harder time remembering, needing to make some changes they don't want to make, learn how to deal with them with honor. And if you're on the older side of that equation, learn to honor the fact that your children are trying to help you, not harm you, and work through whatever has to be worked through. Because when we live with honor, God is amazing what He does. Still remember when I got the phone call that my mother had broken her hip. in her early 80s, a very independent person who could take care of herself, still living in our hometown where none of us lived. And I got the phone call. She's broken her hip, early 80s. She became functionally blind when she was about 80 because of macular degeneration. She could still see, but very marginally. And yet she lived on her own until she was 90. So I said, how'd she break her hip? Well, she fell off her trampoline. I don't know if any of you remember the little exercise trampolines that were real popular years ago. I don't see many of them today, and I think my mother's story is one of the reasons why. Come to find out, my mom was still functioning as an independent adult. And every day, she was jumping on her trampoline for exercise till that one day when she lost her balance. So we didn't ask her, even though she would have been okay with it. We got rid of the trampoline. That was the responsible thing to do as kids. But it was just neat to watch how my mother adapted. How, when I went to stay with her during that time, it was so strange to be the caregiver when she's the one who, when I was a kid, who always made soup for me when I was sick. And now I'm her caregiver for a few days. Changes. But I wouldn't take anything for the relationship. That in all of that, I honored her and she honored me. It's my prayer that every one of us will find that place. Because if you honor your parents, even if you're having to honor the position more than the person, God's promised you'll live long on the earth. God, help us let that truth soak in. Help us to live it. Help us to be the people that you want us to be. Let your glory be revealed in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.